We've read that the film was actually inspired by a historic photograph depicting a masquerade that was hosted by Alfred Roch. And the original photograph was taken in 1924, excuse me, and you've relocated it historically and framed it in your work as having taken place in 1942. Can you tell us a little bit about how you encountered the photograph and what about it inspired you to take this sort of bendable, reframable approach to history?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so thank you all for sticking around for the conversation. It's now 7 or 8 years ago that I made this film, so I'll be refreshing my memory as we talk.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, this was the first project that I did that had to do with archives and had any archival research attached to it. And I was looking quite broadly at any kind of documents of Palestinian nightlife or music life, a kind of urban modernity of Palestine before 1948. Because, of course, the history of Palestine has been overshadowed by the Nakba and the erasure of 48, and there's not so much awareness or history or documentation of just daily life before that, before the framing of the whole erasure of statehood.
Yeah.
So, and I was particularly interested in the upper class that were kind of, let's say, leading what looks like modernity to us today, or that early modernity of the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. And it's in this research that I came across Alfred Roch's masquerade parties. So he would host these parties once a year at his house in Jaffa, and would invite his friends, basically, from Jaffa, but also Jerusalem, Haifa. They would come, and each year there would be a different theme party, let's say. And this particular one was Pierrots. I had also found another where they were dressed as Indian Maharajas. And I was particularly drawn to this kind of character of the Pierrot, who's the kind of sad clown in the Italian early modern commedia dell'arte. So yeah, in this kind of short recreation, the film is a recreation of this photograph, but as a short film that's taking place at once as an imaginary of pre-1948, but also in present-day Palestine, or in 2012 when it was shot. And what I was interested in was the kind of bifurcated relationship of Palestine to the British Empire under early Palestinian nationalism. And particularly, as I mentioned, kind of the upper class or the politics of the notables who were the ruling class or the Palestinian leadership that occupied a kind of political role as intermediaries between representatives of the Palestinian people and their political visions. But also vice versa, basically translating the British Empire or the British mandates, policies back to their people. So there were these intermediaries within certain limits, of course, because they were leadership under a kind of colonial state. And in a sense, I felt like they had allied themselves with Europe, particularly with Britain and France, in order to kind of get rid of the Ottomans during the First World War, momentarily thinking that kind of colonial rule would help them kind of, let's say, fulfill certain visions, again, of modernity or new form of statehood. But even when they started to discover their kind of the colonialist side of European empires, they continued seeing them as a model for modernity and progress. So this was maybe my general interest in this class and in this kind of moment of how, on the one hand, there was a kind of resistance to the colonial project and a slowly growing awareness of how this is going to mean the erasure of Palestine, but how they were still seen as a kind of model for modernity and a model for progress to mimic. And in a sense, I felt like there's a degree of mimicry in this costume party.
Absolutely.
So in a sense, the British is kind of like an earlier phase of what the Jews also came to be. So they're seen both as an enemy or as occupiers, or kind of part of the colonizing force of Palestine, but also again of the model of modernity and national awakening. So it's this kind of violent relationship between the two that I was interested in exploring.
You've brought up some interesting things about the tension, the occupying forces, both the historical one and the ongoing presence of, obviously, Israel's occupation and annexation of territories in Palestine. Can you tell us a little bit, actually, about, there's a sense of tension in the video, this dripping that takes place in the background of the work that we hear in the beginning and sort of follows us at the end when we see a scene where there's a cave. Can you tell us about sort of this buildup of pressure that sort of serves as a metaphor for the events that led to colonial occupation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in a way, I felt there was something ironic about this photograph of a group of kind of upper-class Palestinian leaders dressed as sad clowns. Yeah. So I felt like there is a kind of a premonition of something that's yet to come that they're maybe not fully aware or prepared for. Mm-hmm. And so that's what it's about. It's kind of the anticipation of something and a kind of oblivion before the storm, kind of an oblivion before a major historical rupture. So that's with regards to the kind of reenactment. But what I think I also tried to do and kind of maybe came to realize as I made the film was the reenactment of this photo for me as a film was a way of thinking back at the Nakba or at this moment as not just a kind of point in history, but as a thing that continues to unfold over time. Mm-hmm. So although the Nakba happened in 1948, it continues to happen every day ever since then. So it's kind of an ongoing erasure, and it's an ongoing erasure of Palestine, which perhaps 1948 marks the kind of major rupture of, but it was starting already before and it continues still today. Mm-hmm. So this is in a sense what this kind of group gathering and waiting for the photograph to happen. Mm-hmm. It's kind of this extended moment of time that, again, we always refer to as a moment, kind of as a photograph, like it happened in 1948, but we kind of relive it and live it every day mm-hmm. as a kind of unfinished historical appropriation or erasure. Yeah.
Yes. And you sort of like feel it in the work, this like subtle movement of the gestures that's taking place. It feels very uncertain. Of course, it's this luxurious party that is taking place. People are dressed in costuming. There's this cultural cross-dressing that's taking place. And then in seeing sort of like the gestures, the awkward faces, the tension is really beautifully and poetically articulated in that. And it enters into a very timely dialogue about what you mentioned, that this is an ongoing systemic issue. I also had a question, since I'm interested in photographs and archives. Can you tell us actually about who owns the original photograph that was taken in 1924? I've seen copies of it floating online. Can you tell me, like, if people are interested in it, where might they be able to find it? And given the instability of Palestine, where are historical archives like this photograph housed? Who owns them?
Yeah, that's definitely a problem, and I think that's part of the impulse of why a lot of Palestinian and also Lebanese artists have worked on the question of archive, because there is no national archive. So just to answer the question of Roch's photos, I know the Arab Image Foundation in Beirut has an original copy of the photograph. Mm-hmm. It's from them who I kind of took the rights to use it, because the film is often displayed together with the original photograph, kind of installed besides the film when it's shown in a gallery space. But I know that there is also individuals who have photos. So there's a Palestinian artist there, who showed me her own family archive of photographs, which she inherited from her father. And her father attended these parties. So she has, she was one of the people showing me some of the Masquerade photos, which I hadn't seen before. And that was just in her house in Ramallah. So I think there's many copies of these photos. The actual negative, I don't know where it is. Maybe the Arab Image Foundation, but maybe they just have a scan.
Thank you so much for answering that. I know Claudia has questions of her own that she wants to jump in and ask.
Thanks. Well, you've mentioned this really, you characterize it really wonderfully, this idea of this ongoing erasure of Palestine. And it's an interesting conversation to enter into as someone who's not from the region, nor is when I'm not. And so I've had to do a bit more research and learning. And I feel that the inclusion of this particular video, this particular work in this program was so important because it offers this important context to pre-occupation Palestine as a cosmopolitan kind of bohemian place that's very different from the West's current understanding and framing of it, my own understanding and framing of its own history as well. And perhaps can you speak a bit more about this characterization of Palestine as a place that exists, even, if only in memory, if only in these kinds of photographs, outside of these contexts of occupation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so first of all, historically and still till today, there's quite a big difference between the coast of Palestine and the inland cities. So Jaffa and Haifa, I would say, did have a kind of bohemian, let's say, society, as did Beirut, for example, or Cairo, and other kind of Mediterranean cities. Jerusalem, I don't know if there was necessarily like a bohemian scene per se. Jerusalem was always the more kind of conservative and religious place. But Palestine and the Levant in general has historically been a very diverse place. And that's been part of the reason, and that's part of the reason which contributed to the rise of sectarianism in the region and kind of the divide and rule policy, which the colonial forces made the best of. But obviously this film or this kind of photograph is not representative of Palestinian society. It's representative of a very particular strata, which is again kind of an elite that was erased with 1948 because many went into exile. Many went into exile before 1948 already with the Arab Revolt in 1936 to 39 as a way of erasing any possibility of Palestinian revolt against the British. So the leadership was already weakened before 1948 because they were revolting against the British 10 years before. So this class was slowly being kind of exiled from Palestine already from the 1930s onwards, and very few remained after 48. Many went to Lebanon or to kind of other places in the world. So again, the film is not Palestinian society was largely a rural, peasant-based society, and the kind of urban centers were, I don't remember the percentages right now, but they were, by comparison, much smaller than the rural populations. But what I was interested in was in that particular class and those circles, which I think at the time I was also trying to think of as a comparison to the cultural circles in Palestine today, let's say, which are not necessarily the same families or the same class, but I think there's a kind of reflection in that. Yeah.
Of course, and that also comes through in the opening narration of the video, which is a poem by the French 19th century poet Charles Baudelaire. It's titled "A Former Life," and it's a very different context, I suppose, right, in French 19th century poetry from the context that unfolds and is depicted in the film even. But can you speak a bit about the decision to include this poem as the introduction to your film and as a way to set the scene, as it were, for this moment in, Palestinian history?
Yeah, again, I think I was trying to imagine what this class was reading and listening to and eating and so on. And this is why there's also Caruso and this opera when Alfred is taking a bath. And so I think they were kind of consuming this European culture. But I think there was awareness, and I think many people from this class, again, were polyglots, spoke French or at least English and other Italian, Turkish, other languages. So So I think I was also trying to kind of break with this kind of dichotomy of like the past was some kind of authentic place, and today there's hybridization. I think hybridization always existed, and since also before modernity, but certainly with the kind of encounter, kind of more violent encounter with Europe. So that was kind of my choice to introduce both Baudelaire and the music at the beginning, the kind of opera. And Baudelaire, because he's kind of the representation of modern Bohemia, let's say, in France, and a kind of nostalgia, very orientalizing nostalgia to, particularly in this poem, he's kind of talking about being fanned by naked slaves, and so yeah, I can't remember all the reasons I had for choosing it, but it kind of set the tone, let's say, of this self-orientalizing, but also lush and comfortable place that the party was, that I was wanting to depict with the recreation of the party.
And I think I wanted to touch upon as well, there's this question, I guess, that hangs over the work of kind of what if or what could have been, and I think it's I thought it was interesting to pair this work with Larissa's, which is, very straightforward, speculative, science fiction, kind of looking at the history of what could unfold in Palestine. But I feel that there's this idea of speculation in your work as well, this kind of a question that asks, had occupation not occurred, would this have unfolded into something, or would this have unraveled into, a different kind of a society? And so I think there's this interesting relationship between these two works, which is why we chose to show them together. But perhaps could you speak perhaps to this idea of speculation with relation to this film, especially given what you touched upon earlier, this idea of kind of the dripping, for example, as an indicator of what's to come?
Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, certainly in Sketch, the film is more of a speculation of the past and how it kind of continues to play into our present. So I think the kind of the narrative liberties that I took were certainly speculative. I did as much research as I could to find out who Roch was and his friends, and talk to kind of, like Vera, for instance, she's the daughter of somebody who was friends with Roch, and helped me imagine this moment. So in a sense, I did the research I felt I needed to do in order to have a better understanding of the moment and his persona in particular, and then took the kind of artistic liberty to write my own story over that. So the voiceover is a kind of semi-fictional narrative of what happened, right? It's not taken from anywhere, and it's trying again to set the scene and to frame it as this kind of tableau vivant of an event happening right before a catastrophe, even though I switched the numbers. So instead of 24, I set it in 42 to kind of accentuate the difference between Palestine being a place of relative calm at the time when Europe was basically being kind of bombed. So yeah, I think the work here was much more of a kind of historical speculation, and to try to understand what is our relation with those people today, or kind of how do we somehow relive those moments, or how do we choose to be oblivious to certain things, or choose to kind of continue life despite kind of an ongoing historical rupture, and how that's an important thing. So it's not meant as a judgment, but it's meant as a kind of insistence on life in some way.
And perhaps we can open it up to questions from our audience now. If anyone has any questions, I'm not sure if Nora or Matt have received anything in chat.
I haven't, but if you do have a question, you can just maybe contact one of us to unmute your mics. feel like there's a raise hand function too, but I don't actually remember. Yeah, I think if you're a participant, you can raise your hand.
You can also type questions into the chat if you prefer to.
Yeah, or just type them. Yeah, that's a good point.
Whatever you're more comfortable with.
I think Jeanette has a question.
I'm really interested in the ending. I was very curious about the dripping in the cave, and if you could speak a bit about that.
Yeah, I think I had ideas about time when I was speaking, and this kind of stalactite, stalagmite cave as this thing that's kind of hidden from view when you're on the surface of the ground, but when you enter the cave, there's this whole like hidden world that is almost a fossilized world, but that's still alive even in the form of a fossil. And I don't know, it had some metaphoric relevance for me to kind of, in trying to refer to this photograph, let's say, as a capsule of a hidden world, or a world that we that's again that's not accessible for us, but that also is. So I think that's what I was trying to get to, some kind of capsule of time, like the photograph and this cave as kind of a time capsule that's at once hidden and accessible.
That's great. Yeah, because when I was going, it just reminded me of your message and how over time it was being encrusted with, these minerals coming down. And I thought, I was wondering if that's, something, and you are. So I found it very intriguing. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we had another question too. I believe it's Daniel Kolos that raised his hand. Daniel, if you could, there you go. You've unmuted yourself. Feel free to ask.
Thank you. Thank you. You are well aware of this. It's almost like a still life photograph. Mm-hmm. And I love the way you have taken it from a 1920s, plunked it into a 1940 situation, and then we're looking at it, well, you were looking at it 8 years ago, as a still life. You've placed it in a historically, well, perhaps even a historic cave, because everything was happening around Palestine in the world. And I think you mentioned you were really well aware of that. Mm-hmm. And not only that, but you're also well aware that this was an upper class. You don't see the Palestinians that you see in the streets at any time in history. You see almost as you said, a gentrified European style mockery, and that's the pantomime. That's so beautifully done. Nobody knew that the Palestinian revolt would go nowhere. Mm-hmm. It was like such a innocent as well as an encompassing moment. So I really congratulate you for finding a picture and a theme to highlight this, like you're in the center of the world and nothing's happening. It's wonderful. And in a cave where what is happening, I think as the previous commentator said, is the slow eternal encrusting of something. Well done, thank you.
Thank you for your comment.
Do we have any more questions?
We had a few that were submitted, I think, as part of the RSVP system. And we had one from, I believe someone raised their hand.
Did someone raise their hand?
I see some kind
Oh, no,
of.
Patricia said thanks, thumbs up.
Got
Thank
it. Okay.
It's Daniel who submitted something on the question form. Yeah.
And so Daniel asked, can you talk a bit about performativity as a form of resistance? And so there's this, performative aspect to this work, and perhaps you can speak a bit about how that plays into perhaps a mode of understanding the greater historical or political context.
Yeah, so for me, performing something is a way of trying to get in touch with something. So it's a way of trying to reactivate something that again has fallen very much into the background of a kind of national consciousness and has been very purposely erased. So that's what the reenactment is. It's an attempt of reclaiming that moment and bringing it back to life, bringing it back from the dead.
Beautiful.
And I think we had one more question from the RSVP system. And I think it's one that a lot of us are reflecting upon, given that we're meeting, remotely over Zoom across distance. How has this era of social distancing and quarantine impacted your own practice now and the works that you're currently making?
Mm-hmm. I think it's made for a more humble practice, which I'm grateful for. It's kind of far less production-driven and travel-driven, and it's much more about working from what's possible, which is more limited than before. And it's been a relief. I think for most artists who spent their past years traveling all over and kind of producing one deadline to the next, it feels really good to slow down and have more time to digest ideas and read and spend time with friends in more kind of quieter and meaningful ways. So yeah, I mean, it's just made things slower and in a really good way. On the longer term, what it's going to mean in terms of change of production, I don't really know. I think it's too soon to say, but less travel and slightly less stressful work schedule.
Oh.
And I know that we're basically almost concluding the conversation right now. We want to thank you so much, Jumana, for this wonderful discussion, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We look forward to the second part of the program next Saturday on August 1st, and I'm going to let Matt talk about it for a little bit.
Yeah, thanks. This is thank you everyone so much for coming and sticking with us. Thanks Jumana and Noor and Claudia for the fantastic discussion and the film selection. So next week on Saturday we have the second half, and that will be with Farah Saleh and Ali Cherri's videos. So it'll take the same kind of form, and we'll have the same kind of sign up thing coming your way very soon. So keep a lookout for that. I'll probably post it on the Facebook, and everyone will get an invite like that. But yeah, thanks again to everyone. I hope everyone had a nice Saturday.
And thank you also for me, Claudia and Noor, for the invitation, and Matt for hosting. It was lovely speaking to you both.
It was a great pleasure and honor. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and Jumana and Matt and Noor.
Thank you guys. See you soon.
Okay, everyone, have a good one. See you next weekend.
Thank you. Bye.